I have long hesitated to commit these recollections to paper, for they contain knowledge that the authorities sought, and continue to seek, to erase from memory. The events I recount here were confined within walls that no ordinary citizen could breach, and the records were meticulously destroyed by those who feared their revelation. It is, I understand, remarkable that any fragment remains, and it is only by the slenderest fortune that these pages survive. Let it be known at the outset, the secrecy surrounding Wychwood Asylum was deliberate, the concealment systematic, and the truth deemed far too dangerous for public eyes. I arrived at Wychwood in the spring of 1893, newly appointed as a junior physician. My credentials, though modest, were sufficient to gain me entry, yet I was unprepared for the realities that awaited. Wychwood was situated on the outskirts of a small county town, set upon a hill that overlooked fields and woods, its red brick, buildings darkened by age and neglect. The asylum's exterior was benign enough, framed by iron gates and a low stone wall, but the quiet within those walls belied the conditions I was to witness. From the outset, the children presented not merely as ill or unfortunate, but as objects of systematic control. Their movements were monitored with precision, their meals portioned under the strictest rationing, and their conduct evaluated through daily reports maintained by senior attendants. The official records, which I was permitted to consult, described the children in terms of deviation: unruly, incontinent, hysterical, or reticent. No account was taken of their circumstances outside the asylum, nor of the trauma that had led them to this institution. Within weeks, I discerned that the operational norms of Wychwood were designed less for care than for containment. The children's rooms were small, often overcrowded and poorly ventilated. The bedding was frequently damp and inadequate. Sanitation was neglected. Plumbing failures were routine, and the spread of common illnesses went largely unrecorded. Unless fatalities occurred, it became evident that the institution's priority was the preservation of order, rather than the preservation of health or well-being. The staff, a mixture of men and women of varying experience, adhered to a rigid hierarchy. Senior attendants wielded considerable authority, their discretion largely unchecked, and the physician's interventions were often nominal. Punitive measures, although officially termed disciplinary procedures, were applied with alarming frequency. I observed children confined to small cells for hours at a time, sometimes days, for infractions as minor as speaking out of turn or failing to complete assigned tasks. There was little effort to differentiate between deliberate disobedience and manifestations of fear or confusion. I began a series of private observations, documenting the day-to-day realities that official reports omitted. I recorded the frequency of illness, the inadequacy of nutrition, and the psychological toll exacted by prolonged isolation and constant surveillance. Each entry I made was written in the quiet of my office, in the late hours after the children were locked in their dormitories, for I knew that the exposure of these facts would provoke the ire of both the institution and the authorities. It is perhaps necessary to convey that I witnessed a decline not only in the physical condition of the children, but also in their capacity for social interaction and expression. They became withdrawn, uncommunicative, and, in many cases, incapable of forming attachment to either staff or peers. The very language they used contracted over time, reduced to monosyllables or whispered mutterings. In my private notes, I expressed concern that the environment was producing not merely behavioral correction, but a fundamental erosion of identity. By midsummer, I had compiled a substantial collection of observations and partial records, photographs, and sketches of the living quarters. I became increasingly aware of the asylum's internal mechanisms of secrecy. Files were removed from their proper registries, and some pages I had seen in the morning would be inexplicably absent by evening. Senior staff spoke of protocols and guidelines that dictated what could be recorded and what must be concealed. The magnitude of this concealment was disquieting. It was clear that Wychwood's administration, and by extension those who oversaw the institution from the county, considered the facts too dangerous for public knowledge. In late autumn, a particularly distressing episode confirmed my fears. A child no more than 7 years of age fell gravely ill after a prolonged period of restricted diet and isolation. The official report attributed the child's condition to natural frailty, yet my observations, meticulously recorded, suggested otherwise. I confronted senior staff regarding my findings, and their response was firm. My notes were to remain private, my observations subordinate to the directives of the superintendent. It was then that I realized the full extent of the suppression. The final weeks of my tenure were marked by growing apprehension. I recognized that my continued employment, and perhaps my safety, depended upon acquiescence. Nevertheless, I persisted in recording, albeit more cautiously. I encoded certain details in shorthand, devised cryptic annotations, and preserved copies separate from the official registry. By the time I departed Wychwood at the close of the year, I possessed a comprehensive account of conditions that no one outside the institution had seen, and few within had acknowledged. I am compelled to note that subsequent inquiries, to the limited extent they occurred, were ineffectual. Archives were purged, correspondence destroyed, and witnesses dispersed. Even today, the few surviving references to Wychwood are oblique and sanitized. These pages, therefore, represent a fragmentary yet invaluable record, a testament to practices the government deemed unfit for recognition. They are, in short, a suppressed truth. The chronology of life within Wychwood Asylum, as I have preserved it in these notes, unfolds not in singular incidents, but in the relentless repetition of regulated routines. Each day was structured to the minute, ostensibly for the maintenance of order, yet in practice serving as a mechanism of quiet subjugation. I began to document these routines with greater precision after noting the cumulative toll upon the children's physical and mental state. The ledger I maintained became an attempt to record the incremental erosion of vitality, the subtle decay wrought by unyielding confinement and strict discipline. The morning commenced at a time dictated not by natural light, but by the superintendent's arbitrary bell. Children were roused from their beds, often while still in the clutches of sleep, and herded into corridors for inspection. My observations noted the pallor of their faces, the listlessness of their limbs, and the pervasive tremor that accompanied even minimal exertion. Those who failed to respond promptly were recorded as uncooperative or lethargic, language that, in official accounts, masked the severity of neglect. I meticulously detailed the appearance of each child, tracking changes in weight, skin condition, and posture, noting particularly those whose decline seemed most rapid. Breakfast was a minimal affair, thin gruel, occasionally supplemented by bread that had hardened beyond palatability. Portions were apportioned with mechanical impartiality, and the act of eating was supervised with a rigidity that allowed for neither choice nor comfort. The children consumed what was provided, though. Many did so reluctantly, and records often describe subsequent vomiting or abdominal distress as minor incidents. I observed that children who failed to eat adequately were subjected to additional restrictions the following day, perpetuating a cycle that exacerbated weakness and hunger. Post-breakfast activities consisted primarily of cleaning duties under close supervision. Children were assigned tasks according to age and perceived capability, scrubbing floors, polishing metal fixtures, and washing the laundry of the institution. The labor, while not extreme by the standards of industrial employment, was relentless in its monotony and exacting in its demands. My notes indicate the emergence of bruising, abrasions, and exhaustion, all of which were recorded clinically but dismissed in evaluative summaries as ordinary strains. It became evident that the work served less as instruction and more as a mechanism to suppress vitality and will. Educational instruction occurred in a single large hall, yet the quality and consistency were markedly deficient. Children were seated according to capability and discipline, and the instruction was rudimentary: reading, writing, and basic arithmetic. Teachers employed corporal punishment as the primary means of ensuring compliance. I recorded the frequency and severity of these punishments, noting that they were meted out even for minor infractions, often disproportionately to the supposed offence. The children's responses ranged from silent resignation to overt distress, yet such reactions were interpreted as confirmation of the necessity of strict measures rather than evidence of harm. Meals, inspections, and instruction were punctuated by periods allocated for exercise. These periods, designed ostensibly for health, were conducted in enclosed yards with limited exposure to sunlight and fresh air. I observed children pacing in confined patterns, their movements constrained by rules dictating placement, pace, and duration. In my ledger, I documented instances of collapse or apparent fainting, which were attributed to imprudent exertion in official summaries. It was clear that the regimen prioritized control over well-being, the appearance of order over its substantive benefits. Illness was an ever-present feature of Wychwood life. Children succumbed to maladies ranging from common respiratory infections to digestive disturbances and dermatological conditions. The institution's response was reactive rather than preventative. I recorded detailed observations, the onset of symptoms, their progression, and the inadequate care provided. Remedies were often rudimentary, consisting of herbal preparations, diluted tonics, or simple rest, administered inconsistently. Isolation was the default intervention, a measure that further exacerbated the children's distress while providing minimal therapeutic benefit. Mortality, when it occurred, was recorded clinically, with cause frequently attributed to natural frailty or constitutional weakness, terminology I came to regard as euphemistic obfuscation. The psychological toll of Wychwood's routines was apparent. Children became progressively withdrawn, reluctant to engage even minimally with peers or staff. I documented signs of emotional flattening, loss of curiosity, and a pervasive anxiety that seemed inescapable. Attempts to encourage expression were met with fear or silence. I noted in my ledger that children displayed behaviors consistent with learned helplessness, passivity in the face of authority, lack of initiative, and diminished responsiveness to stimuli. The environment itself appeared to inculcate these traits, whether intentionally or incidentally. Over months, my records grew more extensive. I tracked the subtle correlations between enforced routines, inadequate nutrition, labor demands, and observed declines in health and behavior. I noted that the most severe consequences often befell those who exhibited sensitivity or intellectual curiosity, qualities deemed inconvenient to the operational paradigm. Children who displayed aptitude or intelligence were frequently subjected to closer scrutiny, stricter schedules, and intensified oversight, as if to suppress advantage or individuality. The ledger also contains detailed observations of administrative behavior. Senior staff displayed a rigid adherence to hierarchy and protocol, often prioritizing procedural compliance over humane treatment. I documented conversations, directives, and corrections, though always in factual, unemotional terms. The consistency of these measures, combined with the lack of external accountability, revealed a system in which cruelty was embedded institutionally, normalized through repetition, and codified in internal regulations. By the close of my second year at Wychwood, the full extent of systemic neglect had become undeniable. The ledger contained numerous entries detailing the cumulative effects of malnutrition, overwork, and inadequate medical attention, alongside the moral consequences for staff: diminished empathy, habituation to suffering, and rationalization of neglect. The children's development, both physical and psychological, was demonstrably impaired, yet official documentation continued to portray progress and compliance. My records were the sole repository of an unvarnished truth, hidden from public knowledge by design. The task of maintaining this ledger became both a moral obligation and a clandestine endeavor. I encoded sensitive passages, preserved copies in secure locations, and continually balanced the imperative to observe with the necessity of survival within the institution's rigid hierarchy. It is my belief that had these records been discovered by those in authority, the consequences for myself would have been severe, possibly fatal. It must be understood that Wychwood's daily operations, while outwardly mundane, constituted a system of pervasive control, deprivation, and concealment. The ledger I maintained was a silent witness to these conditions, a record that defies official narrative. In subsequent chapters, I shall detail specific cases that exemplify the consequences of the institution's practices, the mechanisms of suppression, and the ethical dilemmas imposed upon those compelled to administer care within such an environment. Over the course of my tenure at Wychwood, several cases emerged that illustrated the extremity of the asylum's conditions and the consequences of systematic neglect. My ledger, intended as a precise and impartial record, contains detailed accounts of these instances, capturing both the physical deterioration and the psychological collapse of children under the institution's regimen. It is in the specificity of these cases that the scope of harm becomes unmistakable. One child, recorded in my notes under the initials JT, exemplifies the compounded effect of enforced labor and restricted nourishment. At the outset, JT displayed remarkable resilience, both physically and intellectually, and was often noted for his capacity to complete tasks beyond the expectation for his age. Within months, however, I documented a consistent pattern of weight loss, persistent fatigue, and a decline in cognitive engagement. Tasks that had been manageable became sources of error and frustration. Repeated attempts to report these changes to senior staff were met with minimal response, and JT's condition progressed unmitigated. By mid-year, he exhibited marked lethargy, a reduction in verbal communication, and a visible reduction in musculature. Another case, identified as EM, highlighted the intersection of infectious disease and institutional neglect. EM developed a respiratory condition during the winter months, initially manifesting as a mild cough and low-grade fever. My records chronicle the progression of symptoms, the insufficient medical interventions applied, and the eventual exacerbation due to exposure to overcrowded, poorly ventilated dormitories. Despite repeated appeals for isolation, supplementary nutrition, and careful monitoring, EM's condition deteriorated, ultimately resulting in severe respiratory distress. The official record, predictably, attributes the outcome to constitutional weakness, omitting any reference to institutional responsibility. I also documented instances in which the administration's efforts to enforce discipline directly undermined health and development. One child, HL, repeatedly failed to comply with assigned labor tasks due to progressive malnutrition. Punitive measures included extended confinement and increased work quotas, which I recorded as directly contributing to further decline. Over the course of several weeks, HL demonstrated significant muscular atrophy, recurrent illness, and psychological withdrawal. My observations emphasize the cumulative effect of punishment as an instrument not of correction, but of deterioration. A particularly instructive case involved twins, R and S, whose physical and emotional proximity underscored the impact of the asylum's environment on social bonds. Initially engaged and interactive, the twins became increasingly isolated, each responding differently to stresses and labor demands. R exhibited heightened anxiety and frequent somatic complaints, while S withdrew almost entirely, refusing to participate in any communal activity. I recorded that interventions from staff, rather than alleviating distress, served to amplify their separation and diminish their capacity for attachment. By the end of the year, both had experienced significant weight loss, diminished responsiveness, and a pronounced flattening of affect, demonstrating the pervasive and individualized effects of institutional pressure. In parallel with these observations, I maintained detailed accounts of operational decisions and administrative oversight that influenced outcomes. Staff frequently justified measures by reference to precedent, protocol, or the necessity of order, yet my notes document numerous instances in which procedural adherence directly conflicted with the welfare of the children. I recorded instances of altered or destroyed records, the omission of critical observations from official reports, and the systematic concealment of morbidity and mortality data. These practices underscored a deliberate effort to present the institution as orderly and functional, while obscuring the consequences of neglect and inadequate care. The cumulative impact of these cases reinforced patterns I had long noted. Children of aptitude, sensitivity, or robust constitution often suffered most under Wychwood's regimen. My ledger contains detailed cross-references between observed characteristics, assigned labor, frequency of punitive measures, and subsequent decline, highlighting correlations that were systematically ignored by those in authority. The specificity of these cases, in isolation and collectively, reveals a predictable and persistent pattern of harm, rendered invisible through administrative suppression. Medical interventions, when applied, were frequently perfunctory. Nutritional support was inconsistent, remedies were rudimentary, and isolation often replaced treatment. I recorded both the procedural actions taken and the observable outcomes, including progression of illness, failure to thrive, and behavioral withdrawal. The recurrence of similar patterns across cases suggests an institutional environment in which the health and development of children were subordinated to the maintenance of order, hierarchy, and operational efficiency. In my private notes, I also documented the moral consequences for staff, themselves complicit in perpetuating harm. While many exhibited concern or discomfort, the weight of institutional expectations, hierarchical authority, and fear of reprisal limited meaningful intervention. I observed a progressive desensitization among attendants and senior staff, reflected in both behavior and recorded commentary. The ledger contains multiple references to rationalizations employed to justify neglect, the necessity of discipline, the improbability of alternative care, and the presumed fragility of the children themselves. It must be emphasized that these cases are not isolated or exceptional. Rather, they exemplify a systemic phenomenon. Each individual instance reflects broader operational principles, repeated daily and enforced with precision. The consistency of outcomes, irrespective of individual characteristics or interventions, attests to the pervasive influence of institutional design over both body and mind. My records capture both the specificity of individual experience and the broader pattern of organized, sustained neglect. Finally, it is worth noting the limitations imposed upon my documentation. Despite diligent effort, access to complete records was often restricted, and administrative suppression interfered with the continuity of observation. I employed cryptic notation and redundant record-keeping to preserve essential information. These measures, while imperfect, ensured that evidence of Wychwood's practices survived in some measure, despite efforts to erase them. In conclusion, this chapter of my ledger provides a detailed account of cases that exemplify the decline induced by Wychwood's environment. It reveals the predictable consequences of prolonged neglect, punitive enforcement, and inadequate medical care, and underscores the ethical and moral tension inherent in my role as witness and caregiver. The children, confined within walls designed to control rather than nurture, endured a systematic erosion of health and spirit. My documentation, though fragmentary, offers an unvarnished account of these conditions, preserving evidence of a reality that authorities sought to suppress entirely. By the beginning of the winter of 1894, it had become impossible to ignore the pronounced deterioration in the condition of Wychwood's children. My ledger, which had begun as an exercise in observation, now bore witness to patterns of decline that were systematic and unrelenting. The repetition of the daily schedule, the inadequacy of nutrition, and the monotony of labor had compounded into tangible physical and psychological harm. The effects were no longer subtle. They were manifest, documented with growing urgency. In my notes, I observed that children once capable of basic self-care had become dependent upon staff for even minimal tasks. Dressing, feeding, and hygiene required constant supervision, a consequence of both physical weakness and psychological resignation. Illness, which had previously been episodic, now presented with increasing frequency and severity. Respiratory infections spread rapidly within the poorly ventilated dormitories, and gastrointestinal ailments persisted without effective treatment. My records indicate repeated cases of dehydration, malnutrition, and the onset of secondary complications that went unaddressed by the institution's standard protocols. The institution's response to these conditions was to tighten control rather than to provide relief. Medical intervention was often delayed, superficial, or entirely absent, under the guise of maintaining order and preventing panic. I documented instances in which children exhibiting clear signs of infection or exhaustion were left in their dormitories until conditions became critical. The official reports, when completed, employed euphemistic language: slight indisposition, transient debility, or normal constitutional weakness, concealing the severity of the reality from both the public and oversight authorities. 1. Of the most harrowing aspects of my observations was the predictable deterioration of children who displayed intelligence, curiosity, or resilience. These traits, while advantageous in ordinary circumstances, seemed to provoke intensified scrutiny within Wychwood. Children of aptitude were assigned additional labor, subjected to stricter schedules, and monitored with relentless attention. I noted that these measures resulted not in improvement, but in a marked decline in both physical robustness and psychological resilience. The ledger contains detailed records of their progressive withdrawal, apathy, and, in several cases, the cessation of verbal communication. The moral implications of my role weighed heavily upon me. I was charged with the care of these children, yet the constraints of institutional hierarchy rendered my interventions limited and, at times, ineffective. My notes contain repeated reflections on the ethical paradox of presence without power, to witness suffering and possess knowledge of its causes while being constrained from meaningful action. Attempts to advocate for increased medical care, nutritional improvements, or modifications to labor expectations were met with resistance or indifference. Each instance reinforced the systemic prioritization of order over welfare, efficiency over humanity. Incidents of acute illness were particularly revealing. I documented in detail cases of severe respiratory distress, acute dehydration, and prolonged gastrointestinal afflictions. In each case, the administration's standard response was to isolate the child, reduce caloric intake, or impose additional labor as a corrective measure. These measures, which I noted clinically, frequently accelerated decline rather than mitigating it. My ledger contains both quantitative data, weight loss, temperature readings, pulse irregularities, and qualitative observations, including demeanor, responsiveness, and social engagement. The convergence of these measures painted a grim portrait. The environment itself was a principal agent of deterioration. The administration's mechanisms of concealment became increasingly apparent. Files were frequently altered, annotations erased, and reports edited before submission to local authorities. I documented these alterations where possible, often in coded shorthand to protect both myself and the integrity of my observations. I noted patterns of deletion and misrepresentation, all indicative of a deliberate effort to obscure the conditions within Wychwood from inspection or scrutiny. The children's suffering, thus, was not merely an unintended consequence of neglect, but a reality systematically hidden from public awareness. By mid-1895, the cumulative impact of Wychwood's regimen had become starkly evident. Children displayed progressive signs of atrophy, both physical and cognitive. Muscular development was impaired, coordination diminished, and attention spans curtailed. Psychologically, apathy, anxiety, and learned helplessness were pervasive. My ledger contains repeated references to emotional blunting, the absence of spontaneous expression, diminished curiosity, and reduced social interaction. I recorded these phenomena with precision, noting correlations with specific routines, labor assignments, and dietary restrictions. There were moments, rare though they were, when a child's resilience briefly overcame institutional constraints. Small acts of initiative, fleeting displays of creativity, or the pursuit of intellectual engagement were noted with careful attention. Yet such instances were invariably suppressed through correction, isolation, or intensified labor. The pattern was clear. Wychwood's operational logic systematically neutralized individuality, curiosity, and vitality. My observations reflect a deliberate, if unofficial, strategy of behavioral suppression that extended beyond disciplinary intention to encompass fundamental aspects of development. The ledger also details the social hierarchy that emerged among the children themselves. Dominance and submission were codified through enforced routines, the allocation of labor, and the scarcity of resources. Children who demonstrated physical robustness or strategic acumen were often co-opted by staff as enforcers of order, themselves becoming instruments of regulation. I documented the moral implications of this internalized oppression, noting that children, even when acting in self-interest, were subsumed within a broader system of control that perpetuated suffering. Throughout this period, I continued to encode sensitive observations, preserving the integrity of my records despite mounting pressure from the administration. I devised methods to conceal the full scope of my findings, recognizing that exposure could provoke punitive measures. The ledger, in its current state, represents not only a record of decline, but also an act of resistance, a preservation of truth against systematic erasure. It is impossible to overstate the cumulative effects of Wychwood's environment. My notes, extending over months, consistently document that children's decline was not attributable to natural fragility alone, but to the intersection of inadequate nourishment, relentless labor, punitive oversight, and psychological suppression. The institution's practices, while framed as benevolent or corrective in official discourse, constituted a prolonged and pervasive erosion of both body and mind. In conclusion, this chapter of my ledger illustrates the systemic nature of deterioration within Wychwood. It is a record of ordinary days that collectively inflicted extraordinary harm. The children's decline, both observable and measurable, is a testament to the consequences of institutional neglect, bureaucratic opacity, and hierarchical rigidity. My ongoing responsibility, as I perceived it, was to bear witness and preserve evidence, however fragmentary, for the future, in the hope that the truth might someday endure where official records had sought to obliterate it. The final months of my tenure at Wychwood Asylum were marked by an acute awareness of the fragility of both life and record. By this stage, the cumulative effects of neglect, overwork, and inadequate nutrition were undeniable. Children who had entered the institution with vitality were now diminished in stature, demeanor, and capacity. I continued to document with meticulous care, aware that the ledger I maintained might be all that remained when, inevitably, the institution sought to erase its own traces. The administration's concern with concealment intensified. Reports were increasingly sanitized, cross-references removed, and annotations obliterated. I observed attempts to retrieve and destroy my own unofficial notes, and I was forced to employ a system of concealment, coded shorthand, hidden compartments, and dispersed copies. The deliberate suppression of records was systematic. It extended to both written documentation and the physical artifacts of daily life. Photographs, sketches, and medical charts that might have substantiated my observations were confiscated and, in many cases, destroyed. The intention was clear. Wychwood's reality was to be expunged from both public knowledge and official memory. Despite these efforts, I resolved that a record must survive. My private ledger became both a moral imperative and a clandestine project. I encoded observations, detailed labor assignments, nutritional logs, and medical records in a manner that would resist casual discovery. I noted in great detail the interplay between institutional routines and the resulting physical and psychological decline of the children. Each entry emphasized causality, correlations between diet, labor, isolation, and health outcomes. The ledger became a map of suffering, a careful testament to consequences deliberately obscured. As I prepared for my departure, I reflected upon the implications of what I had documented. The children, many of whom had entered Wychwood with potential for growth and development, had been subjected to an environment structured to suppress vitality, enforce compliance, and conceal the truth. Their experiences were not merely individual misfortunes, but the product of institutional design. My observations, extensive and methodical, revealed patterns of systemic neglect that could not be reconciled with the public presentation of Wychwood as a benevolent asylum. In leaving, I took steps to ensure that fragments of the record would survive. Copies of my notes were concealed in multiple locations, some within the asylum itself, others transported to acquaintances sympathetic to the preservation of truth. I understood that exposure could provoke repercussions, both for myself and for the fragments themselves. Yet I was compelled to preserve evidence of conditions that, if lost, would vanish entirely from memory. The subsequent destruction of official records confirmed my fears. Files, reports, and correspondence relating to Wychwood were systematically removed or obliterated. Inquiries that did occur were superficial, designed to reassure oversight authorities rather than to uncover the realities within the institution. I observed from the periphery the deliberate sanitization of history, deaths attributed to natural causes, illness presented as inevitable, and behavioral decline framed as correction. My ledger remained in part the sole witness to truths that others sought to bury. The preserved record, however incomplete, provides insights into operational practices, administrative priorities, and the consequences for those subjected to prolonged institutionalization. It demonstrates the tangible effects of deprivation, routine labor, punitive discipline, and isolation. More profoundly, it illuminates the ethical dilemmas faced by those charged with oversight, the tension between duty and powerlessness, the burden of observation without recourse, and the moral imperative to bear witness. As I conclude these entries, I am compelled to acknowledge the persistent secrecy that continues to surround Wychwood Asylum. Government authorities at various levels sought to erase not only evidence, but memory itself. The survival of these notes is therefore anomalous, a product of diligence, concealment, and perhaps fortune. They stand as testament to a reality the powers that be deemed unfit for recognition, yet they cannot negate the lived experiences of those who endured Wychwood's regimen. In reflecting upon this record, I recognize the enduring weight of what was observed. It is not sufficient merely to document. The act of preservation is itself an assertion against erasure. The children's suffering, the systemic neglect, and the moral failures of those in authority persist in these pages, resisting the official narrative. The ledger, hidden and dispersed, remains as evidence that such conditions existed, that harm was inflicted, and that truth, though suppressed, may endure beyond the reach of those who sought its obliteration. My tenure at Wychwood concluded with a departure marked by apprehension and resignation. I relinquished my formal post, yet carried with me the knowledge of every detail I had recorded. I knew that exposure could be dangerous, yet silence would render complicity complete. These pages, preserved against systematic suppression, embody a responsibility that transcends my personal role. They are the record of lives constrained, of health compromised, and of the ethical challenge imposed upon a witness to suffering. It is my hope that the existence of these notes, however fragmentary, may one day provide clarity, evidence, and understanding. Wychwood Asylum was not unique in its secrecy or in the concealment of systemic neglect, yet the specificity of this record renders it singular in detail. The preservation of such evidence is necessary not only for historical accuracy but as a testament to the consequences of institutional indifference and the imperative of bearing witness to those who cannot speak for themselves.